to The Plain Truth, a show where we try to get into some of the mysteries, anomalies, and the dirty underbelly of the world around us. I'm your host, Plain, and joining us this week, we have Lada Ray, who is originally from the Ukrainian part of the Soviet Union and writes interesting things, blogs and novels that mix in some of the issues of that part of the world. And Lada, are you there?
Yes.
Well, thanks for coming. And along for our discussion, a couple of my friends, Disaster Cat.
Hi, Lada. Nice to meet you.
Hello.
And Jerry.
Hi, Lada. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, Jerry, and hello, everyone.
Well, thanks again. So let's just get going. Lada, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Are you originally from Odessa, I think I recall?
I was born in Moscow, but my parents, for job, they were working for Russian railroads. They were transferred to Odessa, where I basically grew up. I spent most of my childhood there, and I started even started the first year of college there, where I studied linguistics. So my training, I have a master's in linguistics, comparative linguistics and history of languages. So I traveled a lot. I lived and visited or passed through more than 26 countries. I stopped counting at that point. And I was in Cuba at one point where I both studied at the La Universidad de La Habana, which is Cuban or Havana University, I guess you could translate it, and where I interviewed Fidel Castro on a couple of occasions when I translated for the Russian delegations, and they were educational delegations. I worked for the Ministry of Education as a part-time job, as a part-time employment, while also studying in Cuba. So so I've been in many countries, and then I settled in the U.S., where I worked for financial institutions, most notably Smith Barney and AIG. Smith Barney was I loved it, actually, to be honest, to be a financial consultant with Smith Barney, which is part of Citigroup. However, I just got very disillusioned with what was going on Wall Street and how my own company was disregarding the interests of my own clients and pushing the interests of large clients, large institutional clients. We literally sometimes were lied to our face about how good the company was because of their institutional clients' interests. So, there was much more to the story, too much politicking, and that was a number of years ago, several years ago, when we did not know much about derivatives, for example, and how bad they are for the economy. We did not know derivatives already started, and a friend of mine who was actually also originally from Russia, a mathematician, she was in charge of the department that basically made derivatives, as we know them today, a household name. They developed those derivatives. She was a PhD in mathematics from Moscow University, and she developed many of these algorithms. And right now we're finding out how that we have about quadrillion of dollars, if anybody can imagine this amount, in derivatives that at some point will have to be unwound, and that is sure to crash the economy.
Lada, I think you did, I think everybody on Wall Street did a good job with them. But then you went from the derivative Wall Street world, and where did you go? What did you do?
I quit Wall Street and decided that I wanted to learn, actually, I wanted to study feng shui and various disciplines that I studied in the East. So I went to Asia, I studied in Hong Kong, and then I studied in Malaysia and received international certification I was one of the first internationally certified feng shui masters in the U.S. at the time, and we're talking about the year 2003, 2004. So after that, I had successful global practice, feng shui practice, also studied a lot of other esoteric disciplines, consciousness, shamanism, and various other disciplines. And at that point, I also wanted to tell my story to the world. And also as we got into the period when USA invaded Iraq, and as that was progressing, more and more was coming to the fore, and more things were making sense to me. So I started studying geopolitics, which incidentally I was always interested in. Ever since I was probably 5 or 6, I was predicting things, and people never understood how I knew any of this. When my predictions would, even in people's personal lives, would come true like 6 months later, for example. But actually, what's interesting is that all my life, people actually trusted my predictions, and both here and back in the old country, wherever I went. So I guess for some reason, people actually trusted, and actually predictions would usually come true. So I was predicting, around 2004, I started predicting politics seriously, but only for my clients. And so I would tell them, for example, that George Bush would be reelected. Well, it didn't make many friends.
No, you mean he would win?
I'm sorry?
You mean he would win? In other words,
yes,
it doesn't matter what
yes.
the votes are. It just
He
matters
really,
who the winner is.
Right. He wasn't really elected, but that was in the cards, and that's what happened. And then Obama and the Putin re-elections and all those things that were happening in Russia, and what happened in France, that Sarkozy would lose and Hollande would win. A lot of people argued with me. That was already happening when I had my blog. Which brings me to my blogs. So my Lada Ray blog, which is Lada Ray, and I'm sure we can just arrange something in the footnotes that people can have links or something, so they could visit my blogs if they want to. So one blog is ladaray.wordpress.com. And that blog is about 2 years old, and it's very, very popular. I've got a lot of viewership on that blog, and I write about Russia culturally, primarily culture, history, my own recollections. I write about my books, a little bit of writing, and also predictions, and a little bit of feng shui and interesting cultural things from around the world. And it was a very nice, very positive blog always. And so when I started, when I decided that I actually wanted to share with the world all the knowledge and wisdom I accumulated over the years about geopolitics, economics, everything, all the dirty underbelly of the system that I learned about, both financial, economical, as well as geopolitical, just having been around this and having lived in under the Soviet system, then under capitalism here, and everywhere in between, really, all kinds of countries. When I started putting the two and two together, I arrived at very interesting conclusions, but for a long time I hesitated because my readership on Lada Ray blog was really not that kind of readership. They were the kind of people that had basically nice, extremely nice people, a lot of spiritual people, animal lovers, which of course is terrific, but some perhaps had rosy glasses on. Some perhaps didn't want to hear about what was really going on behind the scenes in the world. And so one day I took a plunge and started Futurist Trendcast blog. And Futurist Trendcast was kind of dormant for several months. And then events in Ukraine happened. And as I was watching all that unfold, that hit so close to home that there was absolutely no possibility of me keeping silence anymore. So I basically started blogging about Ukraine, and so far I've written 8 articles about Ukraine, different facets, explaining cultural, historical implications, and also giving my predictions and assessment of what's happening, and trying to explain. I'm still planning an article, for example, about history and linguistical side of the whole story, which is very interesting in itself. So once I started blogging, actually this post started going viral. And that little blog that I started, Futurist Trendcast, it basically, all of a sudden, a lot of people are reposting or quoting. They know this blog now, and it was just a total unknown just basically a week ago. Because I never paid attention to it. So that's the story in short.
Okay, well, that's a good start. And then people can just, of course, do an internet search on your name, and that will narrow it down. So that's Lada Ray, and so that will help. But now that we're into the Ukrainian question, perhaps we can start with just a high-level discussion of, for example, what does the word Ukraine mean? Does it mean borderlands?
Yes, well, that's a very good question. And as a linguist, I can tell you that, let's just sum it up. So Ukraine really was known as Malorossiya in Russia for hundreds of years. Malorossiya means Russia Minor, as opposed to the Great Russia, which is Russia proper. And if you look at the comparative size of both, you know why this is minor and that one is Great Russia. But of course, unfortunately, some Ukrainians take that personally, kind of, sort of, like, how come we're minor and you're great? So that's where all these problems start, misunderstandings start. Then at some point, probably in 19th century, the name, probably because it was offensive, possibly to some, was substituted, and the name Ukraine appeared. In Ukrainian, it sounds like this: Vkraina. It's not Ukraine. In Russian, sounds Ukraina, and it means the outskirts. Okraina, the word Okraina, means outskirts in Russian and in Ukrainian as well. Okay, so the land, the piece of land that is on the outskirts. Okay, which brings us to another issue. If you would like to discuss this, just let me know. Is the divisions within Ukraine. Technically, Ukraine is divided into 4 parts, not even in 2 parts, but 4 parts with distinctly different character. Would you actually even 5 parts if you take Crimea as a separate entity? Would you like me to discuss that?
Sure.
Okay, so 4 parts of Crimea are the western. I'm sorry, for parts of Ukraine, obviously, is Western Ukraine, Northern Ukraine, with Kiev as capital. Anybody can go to the map and just see those parts for themselves. Then Eastern Ukraine and Southern Ukraine. Crimea, I'm lumping here with Southern Ukraine, although probably it should be separated even from that. Now, Eastern Ukraine is the industrial base of the country. A lot of GDP, probably a huge chunk of GDP, comes from there. So Donbass, which has been in the news as a lot of pro-Russian protests have been happening there, and actually terrible things are happening there. At some point in the interview, we should really touch upon how they kidnapped the new elected governor. That people elected, people's governor, they call him. They kidnapped him and just took him away. He disappeared. But back to the story. So this area was always traditionally Russian. It was part of the Russian Empire. It wasn't even considered part of the Ukraine. That's Donbass, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kharkov to the extent. There's also Lugansk in that area. That's traditionally Russian although some Ukrainians live there, and some Ukrainians also moved there from more Ukrainian parts over the years because employment is better there. Southern Ukraine, what is now southern Ukraine, with Odessa as the main city, a large seaport, resort, very large cultural center, and I grew up there. So I know it backwards and forwards. Odessa, then there is also Nikolaev, named after Nicholas first, Russian emperor, and Kherson, another city. These three cities, there are other cities, but these are like larger ones. They are all ports and bases of, there are navy yards there, shipbuilding yards, they're bases of, former bases of the Russian fleet. And then, of course, there is Crimea. Crimea is absolutely separate story. Crimea wasn't even part of Ukraine until 1954. It's a very long story. It's commonly called the city of the Russian glory. That's its nickname. It's also the hero city from the Second World War, one of the few hero cities of the Soviet Union. And this is the base since 1776 of the Russian fleet. A lot of the population, especially in Sevastopol is the city where the fleet is based. Most of the population are former officers of the Soviet and Russian fleet and their families. Well, it is very hard to imagine that they ever actually liked being lumped with Ukraine, because that came as a huge shock for them. In fact, it was a huge humanitarian catastrophe, all this division of the Soviet Union, when people who thought they lived in one country all of a sudden were torn apart and became parts of countries they never bargained to become parts of. And southern Ukraine, as well as Crimea, they're also resorts. They are stretched along the Black Sea. And now northern Ukraine is a traditional Ukrainian mainland, basically, what was called Malorossia or Russia Minor. And in ancient times, it was the so-called Kievan Rus. And Rus, obviously from same as Russia, Rus is the self-name of the Russian people. Okay, it was not called Kievan Ukraine, it was called Kievan Rus. That brings me back to the point that this is one people. These are not incidentally, I forgot to mention that my father was Russian, coming from a very noble background in Russia. And he married, when he was young and very romantic, he married a very pretty Ukrainian girl, my mother, because Ukrainian girls are usually very pretty. So, that's the story. I'm half Russian, half Ukrainian. And she was from a very different background. She was from a village in Ukraine, and when she grew up speaking Ukrainian, she only learned to speak Russian properly when she went to college in Dnipropetrovsk, which is eastern Ukraine. And then when she came to work in Odessa, first in Moscow and then in Odessa, she only spoke Russian, and perfectly, by the way. She completely lost any accent, which again proves how easy it is to do. So back to the story. So northern Ukraine is basically mainland, Ukraine proper. And Kiev is pretty bureaucratic, and northern Ukraine is very agricultural. So basically southern Ukraine, with its very developed industry, seaports, and education, and agriculture is good there as well as tourism. And eastern Ukraine, with all of its developed industry, they feed north. In addition, they also feed the western Ukraine. And western Ukraine, main city there is Lvov. There is also Uzhgorod as well, and a couple of others, Ivano-Frankovsk, I believe, as well. unfortunately was passing between many countries for centuries. In around 8th, 10th century, it was called, even in 12th century and 14th even, I believe, it was called Галицкая Rus. There were princes Galitskie or Galitsky princes that were governors or rulers of that area. Again, it was called Галицкая Rus. Again, the same word, Rus, right? Unfortunately, in the past several years, the population was turned Catholic. And of course, they were Orthodox before that. And basically, the rift started developing. Parts of Western Ukraine were parts of Austria-Hungary, Poland, Romania, and of course, in certain times,
Lithuania, the Lithuanian Empire.
Lithuania, that's right, exactly. Thank you. I was thinking what else, and of course, Russian Empire. And so it was passing from hands to hands, and you know how it happens. It's like some kid at a foster home, passing between from hands to hands, foster home after foster home. They forget who they are, and they also become very angry at the world and themselves, and they start denying who they are. Well, most foster kids, when they grow up, they try to find their real parents. They try to learn. Unfortunately, this is not happening in this case. Maybe they haven't grown up yet. I mean, that would be one of possible.
Well, it's also the question of, you know, they're going to say, in fairness, what kind of parents did I have, right? If, you know, they may have the feeling that, you know, life under Stalin or whatever was so bad. You know what I mean? It's not, you know, this is not a simple story here. But I think there are a couple ways.
Yeah.
I mean, like you're saying, though, there are leftovers from these empires, right? I mean, there is a Hungarian-speaking area, a Romanian-speaking area, right? So it's not just a question of Russians and Ukrainians. There's a little bit more to it. And, you know, from another perspective, perhaps the most famous geopolitical, you know, strategist type from the eastern area, from Russia, would be Alexander Dugin. And I've heard him say essentially that in a way you could look at Ukraine as three major areas, which would be the eastern area, which is basically just historically part of Russia, and then the western area, which is this place that went back and forth between Poland and Austro-Hungary and so on and so forth, and then kind of and I don't know what you to call it, but this middle area where Kiev is a bit of he calls it a bit of an artificial construct. In other words, the capital of the east is Kharkov, and then the capital of the west is Lvov. And it's kind of like Kiev is this compromise in the middle that isn't really a major world-class city the way that, say, Moscow or Warsaw or something is.
Well, yeah, that's what he thinks, right?
That's just an opinion, but I mean,
I'm not very familiar with him, but I can tell you that I disagree absolutely, because what I said, that's actually the truth. It's four main parts, or you can also separate Crimea as a separate part, but it is culturally and technically it's lumped with the South. Well, neither South nor East were actually parts of Ukraine. And so the South, unfortunately, as well as the East, well, a lot of people think it was Khrushchev who added them, but no, it was actually Lenin. Lenin had his own ideas about things. And one of the ideas was that we should have a union of Soviet socialist republics, and let's beef up each republic as much as we can. So they're all rich. Let's spread the wealth. Well, he did not think about the population, obviously, living in those parts, whether they would agree with this idea or not. And so that's how Odessa, I grew up in Odessa. I know how people always felt about this. They
Some
always
people, Lada, if I could just jump in,
Sure.
some commentators I've heard have actually speculated that Lenin sort of wanted to send those territories to Ukraine to sort of mix up the population and make them a little bit more Russianized, I guess. Do you think there's any
That
validity to that?
is absolutely, that was part of the reason, because there were problems with the rest of Ukraine. Look, we just started discussing it, but everything that was said about the controversies and the kind of very bitter possibly parts of history and memories, say during Stalin, that is absolutely correct, of course. You know, it's a separate discussion how much of that is actually has been artificially kind of propagandized to people, and how much is true. There is a lot of information coming out. A terrific new author who is #1 best-selling author in Russia right now, Nikolai Starikov. He goes a lot into what really was happening in Ukraine, and he talks a lot about Stalin, for example, and his policies. He wrote about 12 books, and he's also an excellent speaker, but nothing is available in English because that's not something they would publish here. But I listen to him all the time, and his books can be found in Russian. So he disputes a lot of claims about all kinds of historical, what is understood even in Russia, what I studied back in the Soviet Union in grammar school as the history, how many people died during Golodomor, so-called Golodomor, which is translated incorrectly into English as Holodomor. You know, Golodomor in Russian and Ukrainian means dying from hunger. Holodomor means dying from cold. So it's a very funny linguistical problem here. But back to diluting the population, yes, that was one of the reasons, obviously. It was not very well thought out, though. It was terribly thought out, because it was all done haphazardly. And unfortunately, both Russia and the Soviet Union often had problems with their leaders deciding something on a whim. This is why Putin, for example, is such a refreshing leader who actually weighs everything very, very thoroughly, extremely thoroughly. I mean, hopefully we will get to Putin's role and what he's doing and what he's thinking to do later in the interview, because that's a very involved discussion. But
Lada,
yeah,
let me add something here.
sure.
So one of the main things Putin has been pushing for is something he calls the dictatorship of the law. And the idea of that is that the Soviet Union was, and the Yeltsin Russia was very lawless, basically. I mean, things happened in a bureaucratic way, but with no law. And so Khrushchev transferred the Crimea to the Ukraine in 1954 as like a birthday present kind of thing, or whatever. Maybe he was drunk or whatever, but he was originally from the Ukraine, right?
You're right.
And I mean, and to think about that, that's absolutely crazy. The idea that one guy can make that kind of a decision. So you can see how bad the Soviet Union was in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah. This whole discussion about how Crimea was transferred, and this whole 4-part discussion is actually on my blog, futuristtrendcast.com. I'm sorry, futuristtrendcast with 1 T, futuristtrendcast.wordpress.com, or people can just Google my name, as you correctly suggested, Lada Ray, Ladaray, and they can find a lot of that in my articles about Ukraine. However, what really happened, just briefly, Khrushchev, who was originally from Ukraine, that is correct, and who also was very drunk when he was doing that. He was celebrating 300. How ironic is that? Do you know what the present was for? It was 300 years anniversary of unification of Russia and Ukraine. How ironic is that? That's what the present was for. That's how Ukraine got Crimea. Because 300 years prior to 1954, okay, do your math, Ukraine asked Russia to be admitted as part of the Russian Empire. And so now fast forward to today, and what do we have? Right?
Well, I think we have a lot of arsonists, to be honest. I think we have a lot of people in the West who see Russia as a serious competitor, or at least their vision and alliance with China and other countries as being a real challenge to the U.S. domination of the world, and they don't like it. And so that, anyway, that's my opinion. But what do we see? What do you think?
Well, you are absolutely correct. It actually goes much further than that, but that's part of the whole picture. The whole picture is, I mean, the whole picture is horrendous. It's just scary to even talk about it. To be honest with you, I'm an absolutely and totally decidedly peaceful person. I really want to live in peace, harmony with the entire world, and I would prefer to have no borders. Okay, again, me personally, I'm married to a Chinese from Hong Kong. Okay, I grew up in Russia. I've lived for many years in the USA. My life is intrinsically connected with think about it, three of the largest countries in the world, most influential countries in the world, all three of them. I would prefer to have no borders. I would prefer all people to be brothers and sisters. However, at some point, I just realized it's just not possible to keep silence anymore about what's really going on. It's horrendous what they're doing. Yes, Russia and China getting together, they are incredibly scared of this. This is red alert. They're on constant red alert. But it goes beyond that. Russia has been designated as arch enemy since, the date is very difficult to say what it is, but since, say, medieval times. And ever since, there is Vatican that plays into this. I'm studying and researching this very much in depth right now. There's a lot of information emerging, and a lot of information existed before, but it was never allowed to see the light of day. But Russian linguists, Russian archaeologists, and many others, they're discovering such incredible things. I'm going to write about it as soon as I have the full picture of this, how history was distorted. So without going into that, because that's a very, very involved conversation, I can just say that Russia has been designated as an arch enemy for the longest time. And certainly Anglo-Saxon world thinks so. They believe through and through, and America, the USA, inherited this point of view from the British Empire. And the British Empire, all it wanted for the longest time was to eliminate Russia as a class, as an entity existing in the world. That's how the First World War started. That's how the Second World War started.
Well, they were doing a good job, but I think they underestimated Mr. Putin, especially with his war on the oligarchs. I don't think that was taken too kindly by the Rothschilds.
Yeah, Rothschilds are certainly a part of it, but I can tell you that from all my sources and what I see when I project into all this, they are not even the most influential, or not the main player here, at least. And there are different opinions who is doing what and to what degree, but there is definitely this ongoing, extremely pervasive conspiracy. I write about these things, by the way, in both of my books that are about Russia. I wrote several books, but these are my main two books: Gold Train, Accidental Spy Russia Adventure, and The Earth Shifter. The Earth Shifter, both of these books are about conspiracies that are connected with Russia, or want to change the balance of power. There's NWO forces involved there, and both books are available on Amazon, or you can go to my blog ladaray.wordpress.com, and there is a lot of information there. Futurist Trendcast also has information. All the buy links are there. So going back to the issue at hand is, see, the thing is, it's not just Putin that is something they underestimated. I said before in my articles, and I will say it again, that Russia has this incredible ability. I mean, some people might think that this is not factual, that this is something that is maybe fanciful fantasy, but I can give examples from history. Russia has this incredible ability to resurrect, basically from the ashes. Yes, mistakes are made all the time, things that should not have happened. And Russia blunders sometimes into hot waters or wars once in a while. But it has this unbelievable phoenix-like ability to resurrect from the ashes very quickly. And so all invaders underestimated that. And Russia has been invaded many times, or attempts were made to invade it, which never resulted in anything good. Because what happens as a result, take Napoleon, for example. So Napoleon invades Russia in 1812. He thinks he has it, because Russia was really not very prepared at that point. They were too relaxed. They did not want to fight. And so Napoleon gets close to Moscow, at which point something very strange happens. Russians basically resist them. There is a Battle of Borodino, which is near Moscow. And after that, the Russian troops, having basically, done some damage to the French troops, you could say, and some damage is done to them, they actually retreat beyond Moscow. So the French go into Moscow, jubilating, oh yeah, Moscow, lots of riches, we can loot, we can, there's a lot of food, we can rest. But something strange happens in Moscow. Moscow gets burned down. All of a sudden, first of all, the city is empty, if you can imagine that. So all the citizens left with the army. They took everything they could with them. And in addition, when the French moved in, they burned down the city, their own city, so that it would not fall into the French hands, and so that the French would have no place to stay, nothing to eat during the winter. And, Russian winters, it's a lot of fun. So very quickly, Napoleon had to start retreating. So his army, he entered Russia with 650,000 troops. He exited with something like 35,000. Well, I might be slightly wrong in numbers, but that's about it. And after that, the Russian troops, once he starts retreating, they start like nibbing at him. There are this small militia group, partisan groups, I should say, probably, that were biting at him. And by the time they reached the border with Russia, there was hardly anything left. And Russian troops, Russian Cossacks, next thing we know, they are in Paris. Well, incidentally, does anybody know where the word bistro comes from? Bistro. We have those bistros everywhere in the US and many other countries.
It comes from the Russian occupation of Paris.
Yes, it does. And what it means quick or quickly. So Russian Cossacks, when they wanted a drink in a some kind of cafe on Montmartre, they would say "bыстро, bыстро," which means quick, give me my drink. Okay, and hence the word bistro. Next time you go to one, remember where it comes from. So, so that's what happens. Then, what happened in the very recent event, the so-called Georgia-Russia war in 2008? I actually wanted to go into that, if you don't mind, because that's a very important That's a very important point. I also wrote an article about that on Futurist Trendcast. And what happened here, I noticed the absolutely unbelievable similarities between what happened to 2008 during the Olympic Games in Beijing and what was happening during the Sochi Olympic Games. The similarities are just so mind-bogglingly striking. Well, there's more to the story. If you take Moscow Olympics of 1980, which if you remember, they were boycotted by the US, UK, and the rest of the Western countries. There are striking similarities between that and these newer events as well, except one thing. The leadership back in the Soviet Union, that was Brezhnev at the time, we called it the period of stagnation. That was when Brezhnev was in power. It was called, people called it the period of stagnation. Okay. And what was happening today? Different leaders, absolutely and totally, utterly different leadership. Can't even compare. Can't put them anywhere even in the same galaxy, frankly. In the Soviet Union in 1980, took the bait when it was provoked and went into Afghanistan, which provoked the boycott of the Moscow Olympic Games. In 2008, what happened was that during the opening ceremony of the Beijing Summer Olympic Games, we all of a sudden found out that Georgia attacked South Ossetia, and Russia responded. Russia responded because it was actually under obligation to protect South Ossetia. There were Russian peacekeeping troops stationed in South Ossetia, and these troops, incidentally, came under fire when at night Georgia attacked the sleeping city. So what happened next was Russia had a 4-day war with Georgia, which they considered a small peacekeeping operation, but it was dubbed in the US very dramatically war of the century. No, I'm kidding. Georgia-Russia war. Russians, it took them several hours to basically defeat the American-sponsored, American-equipped and financed, Israelis also participated in that, Georgian army. Then it took them 4 days to conclude the war. They went like a surgical strike into Georgian territory to a very specific place, which is called Poti. Poti is a port, and that port was secretly receiving, which Russian intelligence knew, obviously, secretly receiving American equipment, American tanks, American Humvees, whatnot, American arms, in preparation for the attack on Iran. Georgia was designated, it was not really a secret in Russia, by the way, Georgia was designated as an quote-unquote unsinkable carrier of the U.S. in for the attack on Iran. And the attack on Iran, people might remember headlines at the time, it was expected it might happen. And yes, it was actually planned, either in 2008 or possibly in 2009. So the accumulation of troops and equipment was happening there. Roads were built, a lot of infrastructure was built by the Americans and the Israelis. The Georgian army was trained. And then shortly before the Beijing Olympics, Condoleezza Rice went to visit Saakashvili, the then president of Georgia. Incidentally, he studied, I believe, at the Columbia University. He finished Columbia University, Saakashvili. So it was obviously a puppet president. I don't think he even tried to conceal he was a puppet president. I think he was happy with this title. Condoleezza Rice comes to visit him in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. And during that conversation, she either leads him to believe that he should go retake South Ossetia, and USA will be behind him, and Russia will never interfere because Russia simply doesn't have the ability, the army, as USA believed actually very firmly that the army was still demoralized and was in very poor shape since 1990s. Or she gives him a direct order to Saakashvili to go and test Russian troops before Iran invasion, to make sure that Russian troops somehow don't spoil the game and don't attack from behind, or, to see how ready they are, to see how Medvedev, who was seen as a very soft man, how he would respond. So a litmus test. So Saakashvili, either he was played or he was given a direct order. He goes in and does what he's told to do. And Russians respond. So they go in, they go straight to Poti. And incidentally, a lot of analysts, a lot of witnesses said that Saakashvili was sitting in Tbilisi and trembling that Russian tanks would be rolling into his capital at any moment and would come to arrest him. Well, that never happened. Why? Because the target was the port of Poti and also the bases, naval bases that naval and other bases, the military bases that U.S. and Israel were or already built there. So Russians neatly destroyed those bases. They bombed the port. They destroyed the vessels and retreated back. Of course, there was bad press and howling, literally, from the West that was happening for a year or two after that. How bad Russia is, how they attacked poor little Georgia, although the other way around was true, of course. And yeah, so but all that ended at some point. Meanwhile, Russia recognized the independence of South Ossetia and by association also of Abkhazia, another breakaway republic. They stationed their troops there, and see, Georgia will never get their those two pieces, former pieces of their territory back. It just isn't going to happen. Never going to happen. Well, Russia had pretty rough relations with Georgia for a while, but they're kind of normalizing little by little, very, very slowly. And the new government, Saakashvili was booted out. The new government is a little more pro-Russian, even though it's still pro-West. And so who won in this scenario? Who won? So what I'm seeing here is a striking similarity between what's going on there, what went on there, and Ukraine
Lada,
right now.
Lada, two things come to mind from this, for me anyway. One is, maybe you can answer, but I've read that Abkhazia was given to Georgia by Stalin.
Right.
And Stalin
Yes.
was a Georgian, right?
Yes.
So once again, just like the Crimea, we have a case of a guy who's from a place making that place bigger, and it doesn't matter if the people want to be there or not. Right, and so that's kind of crazy.
Yes,
but then
that's true.
The second thing from this is, it's clear in hindsight now that Russia won the war with Georgia without really suffering very much. I mean, Georgia suffers from it, but Russia probably did well out of it, really. But that gets into the question with the Ukrainian situation. I mean, this looks like a much more serious deal, right? I mean, the West is putting in very radical people here. They're wearing swastika armbands and, and so how can Russia kind of use judo and turn this to Russia's advantage?
Yeah, excellent question. Yes, so
but finish if you have more about Georgia, but for sure, I think it begs the question of, we can see easily how Russia won in Georgia, but it seems a little harder to see what will happen in the Ukraine.
You're absolutely right because Ukraine is a country with much higher stakes This is a much closer country, ethnically, culturally, economically. Don't forget the penetration, mutual penetration between the Ukrainian economy and Russian economy is tremendous. For Russia, Ukraine is a small trading partner. China and Germany and EU in general are obviously much bigger partners because Ukraine is small economy compared to Russian. But for Ukraine, Russia is the largest trading partner. About 30%, maybe more, of Ukrainian trade is directed at or from Russia. 30% of their trade. Culturally, most Ukrainians are either Russian-speaking or consider themselves Russian. Most. Okay, 70% by some estimates. They watch the same shows on TV. They grow up on the same books, on same stories, on same history they've got up until about 20 years ago. Well, of course, now they don't have Russian channels because they prohibited them. Basically, Russian channels have been closed down in Ukraine in direct violation of any norms, international or Ukrainian or otherwise. And incidentally, a lot of workers of those channels have been threatened with their lives. They've been beaten. Some stations were burned down. These are facts that I'm finding out from all kinds of newscasts. So this is very serious. You know, USA knew going in, spending those $5 billion, and that's only official number admitted by the State Department. $5 million they spent on subverting Ukraine and preparing this coup in the past several years. This was done on purpose, done on purpose right before Sochi Olympics, so Russia would not, for fear of boycott, like in 1980 Moscow Olympics, it was done on purpose right before the Olympics, so Russia could not interfere, so Russia could not do anything. And they succeeded. Yeah, they have Nazis, that's for sure. How Nazis came about, they originate from those who helped Hitler. Their hero is Bandera, Stepan Bandera. That's the name. There's also another one, Shukhevich, I believe his name is. But Bandera is their biggest hero. And that guy killed, I could be wrong about the number, but at least 10,000 or tens of thousands, or perhaps even hundreds of thousands of Russian Jews and Poles during the Second World War. And his division, Galichina, that was the most brutal SS division within the Nazi army. And that's, by Nazi standards, it was the most brutal. It was really bad. Yeah, I don't know how this ever can be resolved. Incidentally, just to mention this, digressing a little bit here, but it's kind of related to everything. The swastika actually is the ancient runic symbol of Rus. You know, Rus culture was the runic culture. That's where actually a lot of people think runes come from the Norse cultures, Nordic cultures, but runes are actually Russian. You know, that's Russian cultural heritage from very long ago. And just look at the word runa or rune. What is it? And then look at the word Rus, R-U, the same one, right? Same root of the word. So that alone tells you where it comes from. So swastika was actually a symbol of the sun. And it's also the symbol of the sun in the Hindu culture, of course, which interacted, and you know, this is an involved discussion, but it is the symbol of the sun. It's a very positive symbol. And then Hitler usurped that sign of swastika and turned it on its head and created this very scary kind of image of the symbol that was actually supposed to symbolize something very positive. And so when they wear swastika, unfortunately, the meaning they assign to it is not the ancient Russian meaning, not the runic meaning that would be a positive one. they assign to it the fascist meaning. And that's where the problem arises. Yeah, and they're scary people. And this is basically de facto power. They're wielding weapons, they're scaring people, they're intimidating everybody. People are disappearing. Anybody who they don't like, they burn down, say, party of the regions, whether they agree or disagree with them, that's another thing. But they burned down a lot of offices of the party of the regions. The party practically disappeared.
Hey, Lada, if we could go back to a point you made on your blog. One thing that sort of jumped out to me was that you thought the original deal that the West offered Yanukovych was essentially designed to be no deal at all, and essentially designed to tick people off, right? Because the deal Putin offered was vastly superior. I mean, he offered what, $16 billion and I think a 30% discount on their fuel prices or something to that effect. I mean, to me, it defies logic why people wouldn't latch on to that. I mean, why would they want to reject that and go for this deal with the EU that was essentially no deal at all?
Well, yeah, the facts are that the EU association agreement, the so-called EU association agreement, Yanukovych was supposed to sign. To go with that deal, the EU offered him something like $600 million, which of course sounds like a lot of money, but for a large country, it's nothing. The country that is in pre-bankruptcy state that was asking for $20 billion to be bailed out back in 2013. So it is clear from such an insulting offer, more on my blog, people who care can check out the entire spread, how that worked, why it was like that. But it's clear that it was a setup, that association agreement was never meant to be signed. It was unsignable. You could not sign that kind of an agreement. You gave up your independence, you gave up your industry, you basically agreed to destroy your industry and probably completely demolish your agriculture, what's left of it. And you were getting absolutely nothing in return. And the country is in pre-bankruptcy state. So why was it done? Because going in, it was a setup. They meant for him to reject this document. Now, so at that point, what he would do, he would go to Russia because he has to do something. And Russia is offering him a carrot, 2 carrots, as a matter of fact. One, 20 billion, it was actually 20 billion that Russia agreed to buy Ukraine bonds with and otherwise invest in the economy. And also offer a huge discount on gas. And that was basically Tymoshenko, Yulia Tymoshenko, when she was prime minister, she negotiated a pretty bad deal with Russia for her people. And the price was almost like the price EU was paying, is paying still for Russian gas. So Yanukovych was getting something like $268, if I'm not mistaken, per cubic meter, something like that, which was over 30% probably discount. So what's not to like, right? Well, what's not to like is it was a prepared coup. The strings were pulled by Victoria Nuland, not by even people on Maidan. They were actually doing what they were told to do. And let's also see what happened, the dynamics of the Maidan. It started, the whole Maidan situation started with the slogan, "We want to join the EU," or similar slogans. We want to be part of the EU. Then, very quickly, it changed to "Away with Yanukovych." So the EU slogan did not work out. Why? Because in social media, Russian press, even Western press, people in comments everywhere were telling everybody, people, look what you're going to get into if you join EU. So enough Ukrainians understood that they're giving up independence of their country, that there will basically it will be like slavery, entering slavery. And so that slogan wasn't working anymore for the purposes of the organized coup. So away with Yanukovych, remembering what Yanukovych has done wrong, was a much better slogan, because in reality, nobody liked Yanukovych. Putin was giving an interview recently, and he said, I don't sympathize with Yanukovych. And I agree with people who want change in Ukraine. Well, I say the same thing. I agree, absolutely. The thing is that everything was hijacked. Those poor people who honestly believed that they were protesting something, corruption in the country, that they were protesting for a better future of Ukraine, they were simply duped and hijacked. And let's also call a spade a spade. Most of them were paid very, very well, especially by Ukrainian standards. So it was not for free that they did this protesting.
Were a lot of these characters from outside of Ukraine, like from?
Well, I very carefully listened to every piece of news, any piece of news I could find in writing or on YouTube or in asked my sources continuously. And here's what I'm getting. There were students who were from Kiev, and Kiev has a lot of students, by the way. There are several colleges there who are all basically, again, let's call a spade a spade. They're brainwashed to believe that Russia is the source of all their problems, not their own mismanagement of their economy over the past 23 years and their own oligarchs that robbed the country blind and still are robbing the country blind. So Russia is the source of all of their problems. So these students were part of initial protests, at least. Then another parts were all these poor grannies who get very small pensions, who are from agricultural regions somewhere around Kiev. They came there, some of them. A lot of young men, and those young men, a large part of those young men, a large quantity of them were from Western Ukraine. And out of those who are from Western Ukraine, a pretty large quantity were actually fascists, trained Nazis. Where they were trained, again, a lot of information, some information is confirmed by eyewitnesses that there are Nazi camps in Western Ukraine, and they are financed by the US, EU, and partially by Poland, which actually even bizarre, because those Nazis during the World War II, they were killing Poles as well as Russians and Jews.
The interesting thing about the Nazi angle, I think a lot of the oligarchs and a lot of the people that actually have the power now, I mean, are they not Jewish people? I don't understand how these two worlds mesh together. I mean, I thought the Nazis didn't like the Jews and the Jews didn't like the Nazis. So why are these two polar opposites working together, I guess?
In everything, in all my research and all my writing, I write and I operate with facts only. What I know for a fact from my own experience, from very extensive experience, from what I experienced myself, what I studied very, very carefully, etc., etc. So I don't usually speculate about things that I don't know enough about. So I don't know how they mesh together. This is very, very bizarre. I have no idea how they can possibly mesh together. I know there were cries for help from Jews in Ukraine when Nazis succeeded in their coup in Kiev, that they threatened some Jews, and some Jews even asked Israel to protect them synagogues and, some people in Ukraine. So there's no love lost there, obviously. And Jews are petrified equally with Russians, just as much as Russians. On my blog, I'm giving an example of a friend of mine who is an extremely peaceful, spiritual person, who is a spiritual energy practitioner. That's what she does for a living and studies. She doesn't even want to talk about politics. She doesn't want to even be near it. She regards it as a drain of her energy. So she was writing to me how scared everybody is, how people are afraid to speak Russian in the street in Kiev. And she had to leave the country temporarily because it was just scary to be there, that she was fearing for her safety. Well, same is happening with Jews. So how they mesh together is very difficult to say. There are some Jewish oligarchs, yes. The oligarchs that are financing, in part, the current regime, I do not believe they're Jewish, though. The two examples are the newly appointed two of the oligarchs that financed this coup, in part. They were appointed governors of Donetsk, which is Donbass, the mining region in eastern Ukraine, and Dnipropetrovsk, which is a tech hub and manufacturing hub in eastern Ukraine as well. So there are two oligarchs. Both of them definitely have Ukrainian or like Russian sounding, basically Ukrainian names, you would say. So they do not seem like they have Jewish roots. Yeah, they definitely seem Ukrainian, and usually we can tell by the sound of the name, etc. I don't know enough about these oligarchs, but but that's what I know. So the oligarchs currently financing this regime, because remember, this is also there was a war between two oligarchical clans. Yanukovych belonged with one oligarchical clan. It's not like he was not a pussycat. Nobody ever said that. He represented certain interests. And this is another warring oligarchy clan that bet on the opposite side. And that's what makes this whole thing additionally dirty, in addition to the US, EU interfering and pulling strings there, which in itself is disgusting. Like, I can't believe how disgusting it is. But there was also war over oligarchical clans within Ukraine. And so Yanukovych clan in that regard lost, and another clan, whoever is considered their main frontman, has seemingly won. Well, that brings me to another question of those poor protesters who actually honestly thought that they were fighting for a better future against oligarchs. And what did they get? They get oligarchs now put in charge as governors in certain cities. And there's expected to be more nominations like this. And these oligarchs, they have private armies, extremely well-trained, and mercenaries that they hire, possibly non-Ukrainians, by the way.
How does the average person feel about living in what appears to be a land of warlords?
Probably terribly. Again, my source on the ground there, she just loves Kiev. Kiev is actually, incidentally, we talked about it, Kiev is a very beautiful city, and it's a large city. It's not a no man's land, as perhaps maybe some people mistakenly think. So Kiev is a very beautiful city. There are very poor areas there, but there are also very rich areas there. And there are very beautiful, Krishchatyk, the main street, is very beautiful. And this Independence Square used to be very, very good-looking square before they destroyed it, these so-called protesters. So common people living in Ukraine. I've seen some reportage from there and some interviews, and that was before the worst started happening, and all these Nazis started attacking. Before they destroyed everything, they were very afraid. They were, and also very angry about what was going on there. So
were
it's
they
not a good
angry?
situation.
Sorry, excuse me for interrupting, but so were they angry at the people who you're now the Nazis, or the people who are acting in this way, or were they already in an upset state and kind of, because it sounds to me from what you're describing is there were a lot of different power blocks and a lot of different people trying to be in control of different sort of factions, and it was the average person just kind of angry anyway and looking for a target. I don't know, I'm not there, that's why I'm asking.
Yes. Yeah, angry for different reasons. Well, what has to be understood is a country that is called Ukraine still today has been mismanaged so horribly in the past 23 years that it's mind-boggling. Actually, I grew up, as I said, in the Soviet Union, and I remember from the 80s that we considered the so-called government, the bureaucracy in Kiev from Odessa. Okay, we always looked at it with disdain. We always thought that they mismanaged the country, that they were extremely corrupt, and I'm talking 1980s when I grew up there. Extremely corrupt. They were always criticized terribly. So there was never any like love for the government in Kiev. But because everybody thought we live in one big wonderful country called at the time Soviet Union or Russia, whatever you want to call it, nobody really paid that much attention to them. So we have bad bureaucrats in Kiev, but hopefully Moscow will do a little better than that. Well, that was basically the gist, what I remember when I was growing up. Nowadays, apparently, it went from bad to worse during the 90s, when they were basically what was happening in Russia in the 90s is when oligarchs were robbing the country blind, and prized Russian assets were sold for pennies on the dollar, or rather kopecks on the ruble. This is still going on in Ukraine to this day. They have never grown out of that period. Russia has moved on and already is building something pretty good. Well, of course, there are problems, there are mistakes, but good stuff is happening, a lot of good stuff. In Ukraine, they're still sitting in that. So I really understand the anger of the population. It is very clear why they're so angry at the sitting president, at the government. And Yanukovych did not really, endear himself to anybody, anywhere, as a matter of fact.
Hey, Lada, I think an important question is, what are the people in Kiev or whatever thinking about these leaked phone calls in the Russian media, essentially saying that the snipers were working for those who wanted to overthrow the government?
What people in Kiev think? Or where?
Well, I mean, we know that the Russian media, I mean, first we might just want to say that for those who are listening to this interview and they don't know it, there was a leaked phone call between the EU representative Ashton and the foreign minister of Estonia, where the foreign minister of Estonia had been to Kiev, talked to people, looked at things, was trying to give a report on the atmosphere. And the atmosphere was very, very bad. The protesters did not have a positive view of the new government, and that they felt that there was a lot of evidence that the snipers were actually working for the new government, so to speak. And this is all over the Russian media, of course, and now it's breaking into the English language world a little bit. What are you hearing from back there now?
This leaked call, I'm sure that people know about it, but I don't think they are really telling people much. As I said, they have there is censorship right now terrible, terrible censorship in the media, Ukrainian media. They always had that situation. Their media is sold out to the West completely. You know, even Russia has this problem. You know why? Because it's grant-based. It's grant-based and also rating-based. You know how the media rating system works in the US or in the Western world? Your rating is not based on viewership, as a lot of people assume mistakenly. Like, for example, you are some kind of channel, like TV channel. It's not based on so much on viewership as on what kind of news you're portraying. If you're critical enough of your government, and then that applies to Russia, then you're getting better rates for your advertisements and commercials that are purchased from you. You get to charge better rates if your rating is higher. It's a bizarre system. It's basically imported from across the Atlantic, even into Russia, and in Ukraine it's predominant. This is the vestige of those terrible 1990s when the country was completely destroyed, and everything was just like, it was like a swarm of these Western advisors that said, you do it this way, you do it that way. The Constitution of Ukraine is written by Americans, okay? Just to give you a little example. It's written by Americans. So,
but probably not somebody like James Madison, probably somebody like Dick Cheney.
Oh yeah, nothing to do with James Madison. Yeah, we wish there were politicians. Well, we wish there was a statesman like that today, right? But going back to this question of what people think, first of all, they have media vacuum. They had no idea. Just that was before this whole mayhem, before. When it was still a peaceful country, so to speak. They had no idea what joining the EU actually, what signing the EU association agreement actually entailed. Their media told them, it was pure propaganda, of course, that signing this EU association agreement was actually joining the EU, which will, of course, has nothing to do with joining the EU. This is as far as from joining the EU as the moon is from the sun, or from the earth for that matter. It's just as far. Turkey has this kind of agreement. Tunisia and Algeria have this kind of agreement. Did that help them join the EU? Right?
No, of course not.
Of course. Yeah. So that's what people in Ukraine thought until Russian press and actually bloggers, people in social media explained to them that no. This has nothing to do with joining the EU. That's why they had to change that slogan to away with Yanukovych, because that EU association agreement was exposed for what it was, that it really was not joining the EU. So if they were lied to that easily, when there were peaceful times in Ukraine and seemingly stable president, incidentally, Yanukovych was the one who convinced his countrymen that it was actually joining the EU. He was pro-EU.
I think we have to get into something here.
Yeah,
and that is, what has Russia been doing? I mean, this seems very, if what you're saying is true, that let's say the western half of the Ukraine was just totally being propagandized about how great this deal was and so on and so forth. Didn't Russia need to counter this massive spending, this massive propaganda attack? I mean, what has Russia been doing the last 20 years? I mean, I guess is my question.
It's a very, very good question. A lot of people are asking me the same question. A lot of people. And well, it's a very complicated thing. I'm just going to try to break it down in a few words. Number one, as I've been saying, and I think we already had this discussion when we corresponded with you as well, that Russians actually believe absolutely honestly that Ukrainians are their brothers, that they will change their mind eventually, that they've been duped, and therefore they have to be treated. It's like you're healing. You're not amputating. Say you have an arm that is hurting. You try to heal it. You don't amputate that arm. So let's re-educate them. Let's be nice to them. Let's, honest to goodness, that's how they feel. A lot of Russians actually feel that way. And you said, Plain, in that that point, you told me that you were skeptical that Russians are that romantic and that sentimental. I don't know. I mean, at some point, sentimentality has to give way to reality. But they are right. This is one people. They've just been systematically brainwashed to think that they're separate. But I can attest, as I said, Russian father, Ukrainian mother, you cannot separate me into two. You can't divide me. I'm one. Okay. So therefore, nobody can convince me these are two separate peoples. Sorry. Brainwashed, yes. Well, what Russia has been doing, they try to be nice. They try to help out. Sometimes they have Russian channels running, so they have exposure to that. They try to be very mild-mannered and not to rock the boat. That's what they've been doing for the most part. They have not been doing what US would be doing, if that's what you're asking, like countering it with vicious negative propaganda, trying to advertise something, advertise forcefully, like US would be doing in this case, like maligning EU. They did not try to malign EU. They did not try to malign US. They did not try to flood Ukrainian cities with pamphlets or newspapers. They did not try to buy the media there. They did not try to do any of that. And a lot of people, perhaps, myself included, would actually think that this is taking a high road. But then again, there is a school of thought, and I agree with that as well, that what are you doing? You are asleep at the wheel. Yeah, I agree with that as well. Both sides are correct.
Okay, but this is just, I mean, you have a fourth of the country or whatever that's pretty hardcore against Russia now.
Mm-hmm.
And, the U.S. is spending tens of billions of dollars, and the EU as well, Poland and Germany and whatever. And so, just saying that, we're brothers, or we were brothers 1,000 years ago, is not going to cut it. I mean, that seems totally, in other words, if they think there's an amputation and you think it's, just a little cold or something, you know what I mean? We're so far apart that it's just, I'm just amazed that I haven't seen a clearer Russian strategy in terms of the last 20 years.
Yeah.
For one thing, I mean, in Russia, they smashed the oligarchs to a large degree, or at least got them under control.
Right.
And Russia needed, I mean, the problem from a Russian point of view and also from a Ukrainian person's point of view is the oligarchs. And I don't see that Russia's managed to make much progress, and now we're in the current mess all because of it.
We are in the current mess.
In other words, let me put it this way. If the oligarchs didn't control all of the politicians in Kiev, then Russia could have made more rational deals and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, possibly. But again, it goes much deeper, much deeper. What you're saying is all correct, absolutely. But it goes much deeper. There are 2 points. Point number one, Ukraine never existed, I repeat, as a successful independent state. That's number one, never. It never happened in history except Kiev and Rus. And as we know, that was Rus, not Ukraine. Okay, that's number one. And that was also 1,000 years ago. Basically, it started weakening around 14th century. And secondly, the interference from the US. EU and certain separate countries like Poland or Lithuania, they are, I don't want to call them stooges because they do have their own interests, but they really are subordinate to the US and perhaps UK as well, in addition to that. But UK is a separate story. Actually, if we do have a little bit of time, I would like to get into the issue of sanctions later. But these are the 2 points. It's very important to understand this. We are talking a country that never existed as an independent state. It tried, but it was never successful. That's why it joined Russia. That's why it asked 350 something years ago to join Russia, because they were unable to resist invasions from Turkey, Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, you name it, Austria-Hungary, you name it. That's why. Okay, that's number one. Number two, as a lot of latest research proves, incidentally by very good, very brilliant Russian geopolitical researchers like Nikolai Starikov, as this research proves, actually the country does not go into revolutionary mode that easily. Even if things are very, very bad in the country, it does not go into that revolutionary mode by itself, unless it is very much helped from abroad. And this is what we're seeing here. So this situation would not have happened if somebody from abroad was not financing, these are the real issues, was not financing those Nazis and their camps. That's number one. Was not financing through NGOs the so-called research into how they're separate, into their separate roots, which actually this same researchers from Russia will say, these are the same roots. And look why, because what you are using, symbolism that you're using, is actually ancient Russian runic symbolism, when it was one humongous swath of culture, stretching throughout a large part of Europe and into Siberia and Asia. Well, again, this is a very separate, very involved topic. I'm just saying that this is part of it. And of course, propaganda over it's very easy when you already have population that considers itself maligned or peeved or harbors any sort of jealousy towards somebody. It's very easy if you invest a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of dedication, it is very easy to actually convince them that the situation is much worse than they even think. So little by little, well, history is being rewritten today, literally today. I mean, just imagine how much history was rewritten 200 and 300 years ago, and even 50 years ago. So everything that we are experiencing, they're trying to rewrite history and say black is white, white is black, just today, as we're experiencing it. It's mind-boggling. They have this leaked tape for everybody, for the whole world to see that snipers in Maidan were hired by somebody else. It was not Yanukovych, and they're still trying to pin it on Yanukovych officially. They knew it since February, and they're still trying to pin it on him. Well, yeah, Western Ukraine, I'm sorry, I just want to finish this for a moment. Western Ukraine, in my opinion, should have been split from Ukraine. There were a lot of people who suggested that, but there are forces, both in Ukraine and abroad, most of these forces. I actually discussed this also at length in my first and second parts of my series about Ukraine on Futurist Trendcast. There are forces everywhere, including Russians, including Europeans, and Ukrainians themselves, that really don't want to split up Ukraine. It is happening in front of their eyes. I believe that everybody has to decide where they want to go, and all power should honor that. That's my personal belief. In that case, on moment's notice, do you know what will happen? Eastern Ukraine, southern Ukraine will be out of what is today Ukraine in a jiffy, and will be a part of Russia. That's what will happen immediately.
Well, Lada, why don't we get into your future, forecasting a little bit here? I think, a big question, we know that the Crimea, the parliament voted, and the people are going to have a referendum before long on, I guess you would say, leaving the current Ukraine. What do you see coming out of this? Do you think, do you think, well, first of all, I assume that's a given. They're going to vote to join Russia, essentially. What do you see coming, the future?
Oy,
Oy vey.
Yeah, it's going to be a very, very, very difficult future, extremely difficult. For several years, it's going to be very, very dicey. How many years, I cannot tell you right now, because actually, again, I said that before, I'll say it again. Russia has, in so many words, I said it before, Russia has extremely wise leadership. I know some criticize Putin for being too soft, including Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, whom I respect very much, actually, who keeps writing about how Russia is too soft on the situation, that are not acting enough. Well, I do not believe so. I believe Putin actually is acting perfectly. This is a chess match, first of all. Secondly, you do not disturb rabid animal if you can avoid it. You try to actually calm down the situation, and then you act. And that's what Putin and Russia will do. They'll try to calm down the situation as much as possible, as much as they can. As you see, my prediction from the first parts of my first couple of parts, I believe, I predicted that Russia will use its soft power and peaceful and quiet, the key word here, quiet means. In other words, not saber rattling, not sending ships and tanks in there, but quiet means, whatever those are. And release of these tapes, by the way, is one of those quiet means. The Newland leak tape and this new foreign minister tape that reveals the situation about the snipers. That's one of the quiet means that Russia can use. And they will slowly remold the situation in their favor. And it's going to be really unpleasant, extremely unpleasant. They know exactly what they're doing. They have very, very good leadership in place. Some consider them too soft. Yes, I would probably agree with that, but they have learned very harsh lessons from the boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics and how they went into Afghanistan and what transpired from that. So they're not going to act like that. And Crimea, of course, that's it. Goodbye, Crimea. Tymoshenko, former prime minister, Yulia Tymoshenko, she said recently that she believes that Russian Black Sea Fleet should not be on the territory of Ukraine. And US and EU and all the current politicians in Kiev agree with that. And I agree too, and everybody else agrees. And so it's not going to be in Ukraine. It's going to be in Crimea, which is not going to be a part of Ukraine. Yeah, the referendum will, my prediction, about 75% will be for unification with Russia, reunification rather with Russia.
Yeah, Lada, but what about the rest of the eastern region?
Very bad situation, very extremely bad. Right now, they've been kidnapping those governors that people have been electing. And Russians who are basically pro-Russian protesters who are trying to take Donbass. Donetsk is the capital of Donbass. That's the city there, Donetsk. And Dnipropetrovsk are two main cities. They have kidnapped people and nobody knows where they are, who are the leaders of those movements. And so right now people are a little bit demoralized, although they are protesting a lot in the streets. But let's remember, those oligarchs that were given the reign of these two cities, they have their own private mercenary armies, and they're extremely well equipped. They're much better equipped than the Ukrainian army. And so Russia said that if Ukraine ever tries to use its army and their own people, that Russia will never allow that to happen, that they will be protecting Eastern Ukraine. So, and a lot of Ukrainian army will not take orders from current forces in Kiev. So they're not going to use their army. What they're using are mercenaries, these oligarchs, private mercenary armies, and they're armies, if you can believe it. Plus, there are reports of Blackwater being in Ukraine. So, plus there are some Nazis that they are hastily admitting into regular militia. Militia is police, basically. It's called militia in Ukraine. And they will be sending them to quell the uprisings in eastern Ukraine. So it's not really looking very good, because Russia, again, cannot just send tanks there. They said that if they try to use regular army, then they would be there. But so far, they will say, we're not using regular army, we're using private mercenaries. This is not the army. It has nothing to do with the government of Ukraine. These are local oligarchs that are doing this. So they can say things like that to kind of subvert the situation. So it's a very...
But Lada, that's a different question, though, because the reason they want to use private armies is because the national army is not functional. They've refused to obey various orders.
Yep.
And when you have a situation where, let's for the sake of the argument say that half of the country supported the old government, for the sake of the argument, Yanukovych, and let's say half was against him. Yeah, but you had a violent coup d'etat. How many in the army are going to be happy with this, right? And are you willing to use force against civilians? In other words, if they got attacked, I mean, if if Poland invaded or whatever, that would be one thing. But, you have to think about it, that these are just rich people hiring people. And they're trying to hire police, and they're trying to hire Blackwater. Makes perfect sense. That's what I would do if I were a billionaire trying to steal more billions.
Right. Yes, the army is demoralized. I actually do discuss it. One of the articles is dedicated to this issue in big part. Is not going to take orders from Kiev. They will try to buy them. It's not going to happen. Basically, they almost gave up on the army. A lot of officers in the Navy in Crimea and elsewhere, they're defecting to Russia, and they're joining Russian army. Some, the only successful cessation right now is in Crimea. But that could have been expected. They have a lot of ex-military there who just live there, retired officers. They have a lot of officers from and troops that were Ukrainian that actually changed sides and swore allegiance to Crimea. So they're joining those self-defense units there. So they're very well organized. In other cities, you simply have what? You have miners, you have manufacturing workers, perhaps in Dnipropetrovsk. What can they do? So it was, and look at the impossible duplicity of the US and EU. Look at that hypocrisy. They were all for popular uprising in Kiev when it was against Yanukovych or against perhaps whatever they perceived it to be, like against Russia, even though Russia had absolutely nothing to do with that. Russia actually sat on the sidelines, as you even pointed out. I mean, it maybe even too much on the sidelines. And now that it's happening in eastern Ukraine, but it's not something they like, because those people want self-determination. Now they're bad. They're terrible. Now they're being kidnapped. God knows what they're doing to those poor people. They could be torturing them. God knows where they are. Nobody knows where they are.
Lada, do you think it's heading towards the country breaking into 2 or 3 or 5 pieces?
My long-term prediction for Ukraine, that may seem improbable right now, is that eventually, and that I said that in one of my pieces that it's going to take several years for that to happen. How many years exactly, I cannot tell you. But the long-term prediction, you may not believe me, but that Ukraine eventually sides with Russia, and that it will eventually join the customs union, that it will never join the EU. It may actually try to join NATO, but Russia will not allow that to happen. They already, incidentally, are trying to pass a law in Kiev very quickly. While they have all this mayhem and this confusion, they're trying to pass a law about joining NATO. But see, that takes a long time. It does not happen overnight. They might try to expedite Ukrainian ascension, quote unquote, into NATO, or dissension rather in this case. But it still takes some time. Russia will never allow that to happen. Absolutely never. This simply will not happen. So whether Ukraine will be split up or not, it is very difficult to say at this point. And so far, the situation in eastern Ukraine is very, very depressing, extremely depressing. People are just simply afraid for tomorrow. They don't know what's going to happen. Only Crimea is in a better situation, but they will still try to sabotage it in every way possible. I know that for a fact. Well, but you know, eventually people will simply wake up. This is my prediction that in several years' time, could be 3, 4, 5 years, whoever is in power, maybe sooner, maybe in a year, they will screw up royally, just like all the previous ones did. And again, people will be unhappy. But when they finally figure out who duped them and why, because remember, there's no information in Kiev per se. Of course, if you want to find out, you can go on the internet, you can dig deeper and find real sources. But most people don't. And the media is completely sold out, absolutely and totally, utterly sold out. So when they finally find out, there will be another uprising and another mayhem, and eventually, Russia will benefit in the sense that they actually will go back to Russia. Will Western Ukraine be a part of that? That I cannot tell you at this point, because Western Ukraine is extremely compromised and corrupted. It's out of this world corrupted.
Well, but it's also, but Lada, let's be honest here. It's not just that. It's that in the Western Ukraine, a lot of people remember what happened to their grandparents, right? They were so shafted by the Soviet Union or whatever that they don't really want to be related with Russia. And so if you had a referendum, a majority of people in the West would probably, if they had their druthers, they'd be independent or whatever.
Right. First of all, I want to say this right away, so that I think I already said that in the interview. First of all, I believe that in self-determination, I believe that everybody has to decide where they want to go and freely go, and everybody has to respect each part's choice. This is a very artificial entity, artificially slapped, haphazardly slapped together. So Ukraine should not exist the way it is, in my opinion. Okay, that's my personal opinion. Russian state may have a different opinion for very different reasons. They have multiple reasons for believing that Ukraine should be kept together. One of them, the reason of safety of Russia, of NATO being too close to Russia. That's not a good thing for them. Now. On the other hand, I just want to say, actually, I want to ask you a question. When you say that they suffered from the Soviet Union, what exactly do you mean by that? Just to clarify.
Well, I think that, I'm no expert in this, but I would think that some of these areas sympathized, like you're saying, with Bandera, right? Some of these sympathized with the Germans in World War II. I would imagine that after you lost, the Soviet Union was not going to be very kind to those areas that backed the invading army. And also was it 1939, or anyway, at the end of the war, the Soviet Union even took extra territory in the far western side of the Ukraine, right?
Yep.
So those people weren't even historically part of the Soviet sphere. So, I mean, you can understand that there's going to be, at least in that, let's say 10 or 20% of the Ukraine, there's going to be even more of a feeling that this is a deal that I didn't agree to and my grandfather suffered and so on and so forth.
Right. Yes. This is an extremely complicated and involved issue, and they were Western Ukraine, which is about 6 regions, and that's a very small territory. It's a sliver of a territory in the Western Ukraine that had this situation. They were passing between countries. Everybody was trying to invade them at different times. Again, remember, this was part of the Galitska Rus in the medieval times, a very powerful state, by the way. So what happened in the next few centuries? Yes, it was back and forth, and they don't even consider themselves, their self-name is not actually Ukrainians. They kind of speak very similar language, but different. It's sometimes very hard to understand them. Well, I know Ukrainian, but it's hard to understand them once in a while because they are, Ukrainian is so different from the different influences they had. So, yeah, sure, they develop different perhaps allegiances, and they're Catholic to add to that. But their self-name oftentimes is not, well, they don't say Ukrainians, they say Rusins. Again, Russians, Rusins. I'm actually preparing an article about that. So it's actually very difficult to understand how they say they're different if from Russians, if their name is Rusins. How do you figure that? Well, it's just just to mention that, but they are different. They consider themselves different. That's the reality today. And as I said before, they really should be separate. I absolutely agree with that.
Yeah. Well, anyway, though, I think there's a good chance that the country will break up. And I understand that Russia wants it as a kind of middle ground, a Finland neutral place where both the EU and Russia can do business and work out their differences.
No, I don't think so. I don't think Russia wants that.
You don't think Russia wants it as a middle ground?
No, I don't think Russia considers Ukraine as a middle ground. But that does not necessarily mean that this is actually the reality on the ground. They would like Ukraine, plain and simple, they would like Ukraine, so to speak, to see the error of their ways, remember that they're brotherly people, and they're invited to join the customs union with Russia. That's what Russia wants. That's what Belarus wants. Kazakhstan wants. They're officially invited, so to speak, to be a part of the customs union. This is a standing invitation. This is what Russia wants, and but say Eastern and Southern Ukraine probably would prefer to secede and rejoin Russia as the subject of the Russian Federation instead of being still a part of Ukraine. What EU wants the entire Ukraine as a new market for its goods and a source of cheap labor. US want, what Ukrainians want, let's talk about Ukraine that is like northern Ukraine and Kiev, what they want. They want the whole country to remain as Ukraine, even if it's not possible. What Western Ukrainians want, that's where I cannot even tell you, because on one hand, they actually want the entire Ukraine to be kind of under their domain, basically. But on the other hand, because they feel that they are, the most beautiful, powerful source in the entire Ukraine. But on the other hand, they say we're different, we're separate from the rest of Ukraine. So it's kind of very unclear what exactly do they want. If they want to separate and join Poland or whatever, whoever will have them, if anybody will have them in Central Europe, That's one thing, but they also want the entire Ukraine. So that's the spread in Ukraine. Crimea, as we know, they're already out. What does the U.S. want? That's the real issue here. What the U.S. wants is very simple. They want to destabilize the region. They want to create as much trouble for Russia as possible. And also Ukraine, this is like a doorstep to Russia. Just like Syria was a doorstep to Iran, for example. And also US, and let's not forget that, EU and Russia have been developing, especially Germany and Russia, have been developing very good relations, and especially economically in the past several years. And US cannot allow that to happen. So that's what they want.
Well, then I guess the question is what you see as actually happening. You see the Ukraine, or at least, let's say, half of it, depending if it breaks in two, more or less joining the customs union with Russia. And that makes sense. But again, the customs union, their version of a customs union is totally different from the EU. It's not, you know what I mean? It doesn't mean, like in the EU, you have to agree to tremendous control by the EU. Whereas what Russia's trying to do is a very open thing. And so that's not quite the same thing. It's not like you have to have Russian troops on your soil or anything like that. What about, so you're saying the U.S. really wants to blow things up. Do you think, I mean, isn't it kind of easier to blow things up than it is to keep things sound? I mean, particularly after you've had 20 years of a lousy government. I was reading something funny, by the way, Lada. I read that like the first president of Ukraine said something along the lines of, in 20 years, we'll be as rich as France.
When was that? That was in the 90s, right?
Yeah, like when it first happened, 1991 or something like that. And I thought that's kind of funny because maybe in 20 years they'll be as rich as Belarus. They're not doing too well, unfortunately.
Well, Belarus is doing much, much better than Ukraine. I'll tell you that. Belarus has stability, which Ukraine really doesn't have. Yeah, again, my opinion does not change, and it does not coincide exactly with the Russian government's opinion, although a lot of Russians think along the same lines, and a lot of Ukrainians too, by the way, that again, South and East would love to become the subjects of the Russian Federation, and well, so is Crimea. So that's what they should do. And the rest of Ukraine, I guess, should decide what they want to do. The problem with that is that the US and EU, but NATO, but primarily US, will immediately station some nukes there targeted at Russia, which Russia can't allow to happen. So that's where the problem arises. Well, I feel that central and northern Ukraine, the Ukraine proper, I would call it, that they will see eventually that they've been duped, basically. And they will go get closer to Russia in several years' time. That actually EU and US will not get very far with Ukraine. You know, at first it may seem like they're getting somewhere, but eventually it will turn around. It will just take some time, maybe a few years, maybe a couple of years, maybe 5-6 years, who knows? I mean, right now I don't have the time frame, but it's because it's a very confusing situation. I have to say that usually I make predictions with a lot more precision in this respect, but the confusion is so tremendous, and the waters have been so muddied that it's unbelievable. I think it's...
Speaking of the waters being muddied, I was going to ask you earlier, but I never had a chance. I just wanted you to weigh in on the media war that's going on between Russia and the West. I mean,
No.
some of the statements that are coming out of Kerry's mouth and some of the administration people are just mind-boggling. It's like you stepped into the twilight zone.
Yeah, yeah, it's horrible. It's just terrible. If I already do not believe that they're crazy. I mean, I was said that they lost their minds, but God, this is scary. Oh my God. Or Newland, that's unbelievable. These people are just, yeah, I don't even know what to call them actually. I mean,
it's beyond insane.
Yeah.
Well, they want, but
yeah.
Lada, they want a war. They want to smash Russia because they want to
Yeah.
control the world, and so Russia and China are in the way.
Yeah.
Right. And then to add to that, Russia has incredible natural resources. I mean, just tens of trillions of dollars of resources lying around, and they don't want to pay for it. When they go to Africa, they don't like to pay for it. They just like to take it, put in bribe a dictator and then take everything. It's the Western business model. And, so it's a combination of things. It's their business system. And then probably there's also, like you said, there's this ideological thing from Britain where they've been against Russia for 200 years. And, it's just a combination of things. But, Russia doesn't play ball the way they want things played. And so, they're going to relentlessly attack. And maybe they lost in Georgia, right? But they may not think they're going to lose in Ukraine. They think that if they blow up the economy and take half of the country, they may feel that they're winning out of that deal.
That's what they think. It's just that, see, a lot of analysts have been noting the same thing that I've been noting, that, see, Russia is playing chess, US is playing checkers. Actually, some people say they're playing marbles, and not even
okay.
Well, the thing is that they are just not smart people. They use the same scenario, the same role play, the same playbook, if you will. But see, it does not work anymore. Again, this prediction I can make with much more certainty than the one about Ukraine. The one about Russia, I will tell you. This is what I see, and well, you'll see how it evolves, how it happens within the next several years. However, Russia, this is Russia's time. This is America's time is waning. Russia's time is actually rising right now, as well as China's. But I have a prediction system, which I'm not going to go too much into. Maybe we'll have another conversation sometime in the future about this. It is called the system of long cycles. And I predict based on this system, as well as many other things that I know, it's based on Chinese philosophy, Qing, and Feng Shui comes into this a little bit. I created this system based on everything I learned in the East. And it allows me to predict with a lot of accuracy. For example, Obama's election, and re-election then, of course, prediction I made based on that system primarily, for example. So this is Russia's time. We are in the so-called period of 8, which is the ruling period of the Northeast. And Russia is the quintessential Northeast of our planet as we know it. If you stretch it into the map, Russia occupies the northeast of the world. The previous period of 7, which ended in roughly 2001, 2004, was the period of the West. And we knew at the time, if you remember what was happening, obviously, Western world has risen. It was the US, UK became if anybody knows, just like a little bit deeper into history, into like 70s, for example, UK was in a shambles. It was a wreck of a country. And all of a sudden it started rising. So the period 7, starting in roughly 81 through 84 till about 2000, 2004, was a boon for the UK. All of a sudden it became like the desirable destination of the world. And that's because it was the ruling period of the West. Now is the ruling period of the Northeast. And this is Russia's time. in other words, it doesn't mean that it's going to be without any problems. However, this is when this is the kind of time when leaders like Putin or Lavrov, another really, really strong leader, the foreign minister of Russia, when they leaders like that come to power. If we remember at the time, at the period 7 time, to get UK out of the problematic times that they were in when British Empire was disintegrating, who comes to power? Margaret Thatcher. Very strong leaders come to power when it's the ruling period of whatever area of the globe. So that's why we have such a strong leader in Russia as Putin. And so Russia, well, it's just that my prediction, Russia will be able to find a way to turn the situation in its favor. And as far as this period goes, it's a waxing period for Russia, in other words, on the rise. And by 2020, 2024, Russia will have more influence in the world. The US will have substantially less influence in the world. But it doesn't mean that they will go away quietly, like the Soviet Union had the decency to do. They will be fighting. They will be trying to create mayhem in the world, export revolutions and their problems, as they're doing every single day. And that's the problem, that the world will be very, very full of revolutions, full of these unrests. But at the same time, a lot of secrets will be coming out. And as they're coming out now, look at these leaked tapes, for example, or look at the NSA scandal. All this will keep happening, and the USA will keep getting this egg on their face every time until enough people finally grasp that, wait a minute, what are we doing here? And as US dollar keeps losing its power little by little, and let's not forget that one of the reasons they're actually also trying to do away with Russia right now via Ukraine is because Russia, China, and all the BRICS are trying to ditch the dollar completely. This is very bad news for the U.S. So they're trying to, because a lot in the BRICS, actually, what is happening with the BRICS is that while all the countries are very strong and have influence, but politically, Russia has the most influence in the BRICS, because China practically always sides with Russia, basically. And oftentimes political influence is deferred to Russia within the BRICS. So they're trying to do away with the leader, with the ringleader, so to speak, of the BRICS. That's besides the old geopolitical rivalries and what they're perceiving as the only way to deal with Russia, to confront it, to always malign it and stuff. Yeah. So
with your forecasting, how do you see the EU's future over the next 20 years, and also the Middle East?
I have not looked into those areas as closely because I'm much more interested in China, Russia, and US. But I can say what I feel the EU should do if they were smart. If they were smart, the EU should distance themselves from the US as much as they possibly can, and form a good, very good, solid working relationship. I'm not talking about like a brotherly fraternity at this point. I don't think it's actually possible because there is too much distrust. But a lot of Europeans also actually would love to see Russia as their partner, close partner. And to distance themselves from the US. This will only benefit EU tremendously, will benefit everybody, will benefit Russia, everybody. If they just form this like huge Eurasian space in which trade will be done, in which people actually will be able to trade and live and exchange, do cultural exchanges with some kind of level of civility. What the EU is doing right now is another insanity altogether. And they don't even understand that they're being played. They're being played by the US through and through. And they don't grasp it, or maybe they've been threatened. And of course, they could have been threatened. There's a lot of leverage that US has over the EU. Like, for example, German gold that they're not giving back. Well, they probably don't have it to give it back. But, you know, besides that, Germany cannot move a muscle. They're an occupied country, basically. So they simply can't say anything against the US. They cannot do anything. They really have no independent policy. But what they should be doing, they should be little by little, they should be kind of trying to get closer to Russia, because, well, that's another prediction of mine, that the new axis of power in Eurasia, actually there's one axis of power is from Turkey through Russia into China towards the Far East. That's one axis of power. Another one that is forming, but again, US cannot allow that to happen, is Germany, Russia, China. And these are basically the three strongest, I would say, all in all, if you take them on real merits, economies in the world. Productive economies, I mean. Well, obviously, US is has the largest GDP, but again, it depends on how you calculate that GDP. Because in my opinion, current calculation of the GDP is just completely grossly distorted. So if you actually calculate it based on productive economy, then those are the three strongest economies, at least on the Eurasian continent, for sure. So that's another axis of power that is trying to form, and US has to prevent it in every way possible. And they're succeeding so far. My prediction, in the long run, they won't succeed, but they will make it very difficult for everybody to exist and trade and do business together peacefully. They will do everything in this regard. And as far as the Middle East goes, again, the new axis of power is like from Turkey. Turkey is trying to come into its own, and it wants to join the customs union. So from Turkey and Russia towards China, etc., in Asia. Well, as far as like revolutions in the Middle East, it's a separate topic altogether. It's going to be. Yeah, they will continue in this period 8 that we're in, they will continue for the foreseeable future. Maybe they will calm down by 2020, 2025, but 2020, 2024, more like. But there are way too many problems there, so it's going to be very difficult. Saudi Arabia might fall apart, actually, soon. Yeah.
Well, actually, Lada, the whole Middle East is up in the air because, you know, depending on if the U.S. switches its forces from that area over to Asia and so on, there's a lot going on there that the alliances may be changing. There was just a big fight between Qatar and Saudi Arabia and such. So, you know, that. And of course, you know, this is all in the background is all the gas and, you know, pipelines, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you really can't avoid the fact that a lot of these wars and issues have gas written all over them. And a lot of people feel that, you know, we're kind of moving somewhat from the age of oil to the age of gas. And therefore, you know, a lot of these aggressions by the U.S. are really over trying to get more control over gas.
Yes, it is correct. We are moving to the age of gas. That is absolutely correct. Gas will continue being a very, very important geopolitical issue. And incidentally, yes, Russia has gas pipelines going through some countries, or they're trying to build them. And so U.S. And EU as their helper or their lapdog or whatever you want to call it, they are participating in trying to sabotage or some somehow counter whatever Russia is doing. Like, for instance, this old, well, it's not that old, but several years ago, Russia started building South Stream to deliver its gas via Black Sea and Mediterranean to Italy, and then from there it goes into other European countries. And immediately, US and EU announced a rival pipeline called Nabucco. And that was done purely to try to stop Russian South Stream, or somehow to put a spanner in the works. And of course, South Stream work slowed down. Well, there's much more to the story. I mean, unseating regimes like Syrian regime, that's, you know, it's also connected to the gas lines that are going through some Middle Eastern countries, and of course, these are projects related to Russia. Well, unseating of Berlusconi in Italy. If you remember this relatively recent story, how Berlusconi's scandals about his relationships with women or whatever, then somebody was tried to stab them in the cheek, and he had to have reconstructive surgery. That is related to the South Stream project, and the fact that he was getting a little too close for the US and some forces in the EU to Russia.
Well, he was a friend of Putin, and a
yes.
friend of Gaddafi. So the bankster types in the city of London considered Berlusconi an enemy, and that's why you saw tremendous bad PR in the English newspapers.
Yep. Yes, that was for that reason alone. Once I saw how he was proclaiming that his role, he saw his role as building a bridge between Russia and the US, and Putin was his friend. Once I saw him proclaim these things, my immediate thought was, oh my God, they're going to crucify this guy. And unfortunately, that's what happened. Yeah.
Well, they tried. But I tell you what, Lada, this might be a good point to wrap it up for today. You know, we can only really scratch the surface, so to speak, of some of these issues. But I think this is enough to give our listeners, a taste, an appetite for going to your websites and checking out that, as well as your novels. That you have a novel about the missing gold reserves from the Tsarist Empire, and so that sounds quite interesting. So we thank you very much for coming. And would you like to tell us your blogs again?
Yes. Yes, my geopolitical blog is called futuristtrendcast.wordpress.com, and I will spell that, I guess. It's future, like F-U. Well,
I tell you what, Lada, let's not spell it. Let's just have people search your name, Lada Ray, and then they can find your blogs, and one of them can link to the other, and so it'll be easy enough.
It will be much easier, definitely.
Take advantage of this thing called the internet. So,
yes.
So thanks again.
Yes, thank you very much.
And Disaster Cat, thanks.
You're welcome, and thank you, Lada. Was very interesting and very informative.
Thank you.
And Jerry, you too.
Thank you for the history lesson, Lada. Much appreciated.
Well, thank you very much.
We need the context. So that's it, folks. It's a wrap. Till next time. Thanks again. Bye.